Welcome, everybody. I said welcome, everybody. Okay, there you go, okay. I do call and response. I like that. So it is my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to introduce an outstanding scholar and to launch a new school tradition. Before I start, let me just say, just kind of look around the room just for a moment. We had to put out 3 rows of chairs. I still have some people without a seat. What a wonderful turnout. Thank you so much for being here. So this marks the celebration of 50 years of Black faculty at Duke University. This was started in 1966 with Samuel Du Bois Cook, who joined the political science department. He was the first tenure-track Black faculty member, not just at Duke, but also in the South. This year, we also lost our beloved colleague, Ray Gavins, who was the longest-serving Black faculty member, tenure-track Black faculty member, 47 years on the faculty at Duke in the Department of History, a distinguished scholar in his own right. When I think about what these gentlemen did coming to Duke, when they arrived, there were no Black faculty, no Hispanic faculty, no Latina faculty, no American Indian faculty, no Pacific Islander faculty. They were first. If you just think about being first on this campus in 1966 or in the late 60s, that was a tremendous feat. What I'll also say is that today we have a group of diverse faculty on this campus as a result of what they began, who persevere, who are determined to be successful at Duke, and they are an important part of the excellence that is now Duke. Our faculty here are amazing in general, but when I think about our underrepresented faculty and what they add to this body of knowledge and creativity, and faculty excellence, it is pretty unbelievable. And so I am grateful for all of you. Particularly today, we are honoring those who are in our underrepresented ranks, but very grateful for you because you have added to and helped to build the reputation of this faculty. You've made it possible for us to have student diversity, and you've made Duke an even better institution. 50 years of Black faculty is a milestone deserving of commemoration, and this new annual lecture series honors the excellence, innovation, and creativity that stem from a diverse group of faculty. As you know, diversity and inclusion are one of the 3 pillars of the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences strategic plan. This is for aspirational and practical reasons. As you know, or maybe you've heard us say it many times, diversity in all its forms is a driver for new ideas, creativity, and academic excellence. We all gain as individuals, as teachers and researchers, as departments, and as a university when we recognize and harness the power of diversity. I invite you to embrace this annual distinguished lecture as an intentional opportunity to contribute to the intellectual climate of the school through provocative, introspective, and lively conversation, and to strengthen our scholarly community. Now I have the privilege of introducing our inaugural speaker, Professor Mark Anthony Neal. Mark Anthony is a professor in the departments of African and African American Studies and English, and the founding director of the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship. He is also an accomplished scholar. He is published in the gold standard African American Studies journals, Souls, African American Review, and Black Renaissance. He is also the author of the 5 peer-reviewed books, which we were going to give away to you after the lecture, which you have already consumed, and there are none left. We had multiple copies of each of his 5 books. We will have to try to do that again. His 5 books, as you are holding, are, I was going to tell you, but you can see them for yourselves. What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Public Culture in 1999, Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture, and the Post-Soul Aesthetic, 2002, Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities, 2013, and the 10th anniversary edition of Neal's New Black Man was published in February 2015 by Routledge. And he is also the co-author of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader, now in its second edition, and also published by Routledge. If you're holding that book, by the way, it's significant. Through his research, Mark Anthony challenges audiences to engage with the ideologies of Black popular culture. He seeks to understand how music, television, film, and literature and the African diaspora cultures impact the societal and cultural norms of the United States and around the world. Additionally, he hosts the video webcast Left of Black, which is produced in collaboration with the John Hope Franklin Center at Duke. He teaches courses on Black masculinity, popular culture, and digital humanities, including signature courses on Michael Jackson and the Black performance tradition and the history of hip hop, which he co-teaches with Grammy Award-winning producer Ninth Wonder. As you saw in the event invitations, Mark Anthony is deeply engaged in public scholarship, and by anyone's standards, he is quite successful at it. His new blog, New Black Man in Exile, has achieved more than 10 million page views since 2005. He has nearly 50,000 Twitter followers. I have none. Nearly 9,000 Facebook followers, and nearly 2,200 Instagram followers. His Left of Black video webcast has nearly 15,000 Twitter and 5,000 Facebook followers. On a day-to-day basis, Mark Anthony is engaging the media and the public with scholarly thought, giving context to modern events, and bringing insight and perspective to public dialogue. It is my absolute privilege to welcome to the stage our speaker, Professor Mark Anthony Neal.
We gotta let this horn line go. Go ahead. Keep that going, Kevin.
I reminisce. Yeah. I reminisce for a spell, or shall I say think back 22 years ago to keep it on track. The birth of a child.
That is Pete Rock and CL Smooth from an album called Mecca and the Soul Brother that was released in 1992. That was the song They Reminisce Over You, sampling a song by Tom Scott that was a cover of Jefferson Airplane from 1967. And it's kind of the song that I think invokes the spirits in the way that I would like them to be invoked today. I'd like to start by thanking my dean, Dean Valerie Ashby, for the honor to address you today, to thank her team, particularly Casey Hamill. My department is here. The Volia, Rick, Anna Marie, Charlie, Michaeline. I'm having a brain freeze. No, I didn't forget Juanima. I had something special for Juanima. Lee Baker, who I first met virtually. He used to run an online thing called Afro-Am, in which he was the moderator, and my first connections with Lee is 1996. We're on this online platform. I remember when Yah was born, as you told everyone on the list that day. I remember obviously reading Juanima when I was a young graduate student. She probably don't want to hear all of this. But I do remember the first time my connections were made to Juanima. It was having a conversation with Cornel West. This is like 1993. Telling him what my work was about, and him saying, you need to talk to that sister Juanima Lubiano. Right, give her a call. That's the sister you need to talk to. And I remember first meeting Juanima. I had seen her years before at an MLA on a panel with my future colleague, Fred Jameson. This would be New York City, 1992. And meeting her in a mall in Houston in 2002, because the American Studies Association thought it was a good idea to have a conference in a hotel connected to a mall. And our colleague Sharon Holland saw this weird kind of store that had all this kind of, for lack of a better way to describe it, ghetto stuff. Wanted to show us, and she's taking us to the store. I'm going to myself, oh my God, I'm here with Juanima Lubiano. For those of you who have been her colleague, you know that she is one of the most cherished readers of your work, one of the most attentive readers of your work, so I'm thankful to give her a shout out today. As I always do, I'd like to give shout outs to my late parents, and you'll hear more about them this afternoon. But in particular, because of the path that I took, as some of you have heard me say many times before, my father was a functional illiterate, dropped out of school in 10th grade, somehow managed to navigate New York City for 55 years, in some cases not even being able to read street signs. He was my first and most cherished interlocutor. My mother, who you will hear much more about, I posted a picture on Facebook today because it's the 30th anniversary of her college graduation. It's a picture of my mom, who went to the College of New Rochelle, and my dad, that was taken a week after I graduated from college. We were in college at the same time at different institutions. I always like to shout them out. I always need to shout out my daughters. If you read any of my work, you know I spend a lot of time talking about them in introductions. Folks who have never met them feel as though they know them because they've read about them. In the introductions of books on Facebook. My oldest daughter, Misha, we're going to get her from Chi-Town on Friday. She's just completing her first year of college at the University of Illinois at Chicago, studying art history with a Duke alum, Lisa Yoon Lee, who chairs the department there that she's in, competitive swimmer, so she's also completed her first year of swimming at UIC. And my youngest daughter, who you will hear a little bit about, Camille, who is a 8th grader, and a rebel and a challenge, and keeps me alive and well. And my wife of 26 years, we'll be celebrating our 26th anniversary this July. We met as high school students at Brooklyn Technical High School in New York City in 1981. So we've known each other that long. She's actually serving jury duty now, or she would be here. I want to shout out Ninth Wonder, who is not here. He's busier than I am. Patrick and I first met at WUNC, Frank Stacio's show, 2005. And we had a very rich conversation about parenting in the 20th century, 21st century. We're both parents of daughters. So we talked about the odd looks that we get when we go to parent-teachers conferences, and folks seem to be shocked and surprised that black men walked into the room, more shocked and surprised when he describes himself as a hip-hop producer and somehow that doesn't connect to people. And then we had a very rich conversation about the song that you heard as I got started. It is both of our most favorite hip-hop songs, so we've been able to bond over that for the last 12 years, as well as teaching the signature class for the last 7. I have to acknowledge broadly my team, Camille Jackson, who holds it down, Micah English, who has been our intern this year. Shout out to the past and Laura Mall, who was the very first intern that we had on Left of Black and served us for 2 years. Jason Doty. There's one person I'm leaving out, but I'll get to her last. To the folks who have served me so well in the classroom these last few years, Israel, Nora, Gloria I.E., Shantae, and then the folks who hold it down in the office in AAAS, Kenya and Stacy Nicole. Thank you for everything that you do. And then a shout out to Treva Lindsay, who was my first PhD student here at Duke in the history department. She just published her first book 2 weeks ago, so I'm very proud of that. She was also the first TA that I did with Patrick. And lastly, Catherine Anks, who's running around here shooting the camera. Catherine has shot virtually and edited virtually every episode of Left of Black that we've done since we did the first one in the fall of 2010. Somehow this young white woman from Pennsylvania connected with the quote-unquote hip-hop scholar from the South Bronx to do a show. She had a very incredible quick learning curve, but because she's an artist, someone who went to film school, someone who's a quilter, she intuitively understood the aesthetic pieces that we wanted to do with the show. So you know that you can't watch the show without both hearing information, but also because she loves B-roll. There's this wonderful archival footage that's there. So I wanted to give her a special shout out for the work that she does. And what's up, Sasha? How are you doing? And lastly, Joan Miner, who is sitting here in the front row, because this speaks to how wonderful Durham is. I've known Joan now for about 6 years. We have become fast friends on the porch of Parker and Otis. She's usually there as early as 7:30, and a whole congregation of folks will come by and talk with her. She holds a salon on the porch, often reading some interesting books. She's reading a biography of Thurgood Marshall at the moment. And so I'm just so happy she was interested in coming out and was able to come out. So now we get to the thing.
I was born in the Congo. I walked to the Fertile Crescent and built the Sphinx. I designed a pyramid so tough that a star that only glows every 100 years falls into the center, giving divine, perfect light. I am bad. I sat on the throne drinking nectar with Allah. I got hot and sent an ice age to Europe to cool my thirst. My oldest daughter is Nefertiti. The tears from my birth pains created the Nile. I am a beautiful woman. I gazed on the forest and burned out the Sahara Desert. With a packet of goat's meat and a change of clothes, I crossed it in 2 hours. I am a gazelle, so swift, you can't catch me. For a birthday present when he was 3, I gave my son, Hannibal, an elephant. He gave me Rome for Mother's Day. My strength flows ever on. My son Noah built Newark, and I stood proudly at the helm as we sailed on a soft summer day. I turned myself into myself and was Jesus. Men intoned my loving name. All praises, I am the one who would save. I sold diamonds in my backyard. My bowels deliver uranium. The filings from my fingernails are semi-precious jewels. On a trip north, I caught a cold and blew my nose, giving oil to the Arab world. I am so hip, even my errors are correct. I sailed west to reach east and had to round off the earth as I went. The hair from my head thinned, and gold was laid across 3 continents. I am so perfect, so divine, so ethereal, so surreal, I cannot be comprehended except by my permission. I mean, I can fly like a bird in the sky.
My parents were not intellectuals in any traditional sense, and they were not movement folk. Just 1 high school degree from night school between them when I was born. I often measure my parents' intellectual impact on me in the oddities that found their way in our home. Nikki Giovanni's first album, Truth Is On The Way. The 45 of Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black, the only Simone record my parents own. H. Rap Brown's memoir, Die Nigger Die, and most random of the oddities, an 8-track copy of Miriam Makeba's Keep Me in Mind. Admittedly, I was never inclined to ask either of my parents about some of the shit that was in our apartment. The series of small paintings that seemed to depict my Bronx neighborhood in the 19th century, the large owl clock, and at least at the time, the junior and adult volumes of the Britannica Encyclopedia. I still remember the day the white man came to the door selling what would become my analog search engine. I was initially drawn to Nikki Giovanni's Truth Is On The Way because of the babbling brown baby that adorns its cover. I at least had clues in what it held from my mother, a huge Aretha Franklin fan, who likely heard Giovanni's recorded version of Poem for Aretha. I remember those Nikki Giovanni poems, Great Pax Whitey, Nikki Rosa, Poem for a Lady of Leisure, now retired, and of course, Eagle Tripping. As easily I remember the gospel music standards that the New York Community Choir performed behind Giovanni. To this end, when I took my 12th grade New York State English Regents exam in 1983, and the exam requested that students analyze a poem, I chose Giovanni's Eagle Tripping, to the likely confusion of my instructors who had not taught Giovanni's work. And if I understood why my mother found value in Truth Is On The Way, I was also clear about the intent of Nina Simone's Young, Gifted, and Black. Before I could recognize the cultural stature of Simone, I could hear the stately nature of her presence in simply how she uttered to be young, gifted, and black. Years later, as an adult, while doing radio in Western New York, my wife would tease me for the way I uttered the word black on air during my program, Soul Expressions, me realizing that it was Nina Simone, whose music was prominently featured every Sunday morning, who taught me to say it that way. More tellingly, as part of the first cohorts that experienced the Head Start program, and the very cohort that Sesame Street was developed for, Young, Gifted, and Black was seemingly in every Black parent's parenting toolkit. There's really no way to truly index how powerful those 3 words sung by the regal Miss Simone were for a generation whose parents imagined so much for the futures of their children. When I began college in the early 1980s, I was immediately politicized on campus, courtesy of a fully engaged Black student union, which was led by a student from Buffalo who was in the midst of joining the Nation of Islam. He is now the head of the Nation, as so many lovingly refer to the organization in the city of Buffalo. But he introduced me to figures like Hakeem Mahmoudi, John Henry Clark, Sonia Sanchez, Nathan and Julia Hare, Kwame Ture, Amiri Baraka, Yosef Ben Jochannan, and Gil Noble, who all visited my campus. I went back to the small bookshelf in my parents' bedroom where I remembered that copy of H. Rap Brown's Die Nigger Die. The book was literally the only inkling that my parents ever provided that they were even aware of the Black Power movement. We never talked about the Black Panthers. We never talked about SNCC. We never talked about King, for that matter. And it was understandable. They were working class Black folks who were simply imagining the best future for their child. All they knew was the grind, hoping the grind would provide their son with opportunities they couldn't imagine for themselves, like private schooling at the local all-Black 7-day Adventist school. I met my best friend of 45 years in that school. We are godparents to each other's daughters, and it's in his Bronx apartment at age 13 that I met his cousin, who was Martin Luther King's speechwriter and a historian of some note, the late Vincent Harding. Ironically, it was that same small bookshelf in my parents' home where I would later find my mother's copy of Angela Davis's Woman, Race, and Class, the product of her own grind in the 1980s, earning her college degree at the College of New Rochelle's Bronx campus in Co-op City, a degree that was subsidized by District Council 37, Local 372, one of the largest municipal unions in New York City. My mother's copy of Woman, Race, and Class, which I liberated from her shelf during my graduate years working with Alexis DeVoe, and later gifted to Joan Morgan, the hand-picked BFF my mother chose for me when I was a child, who is now known as the mother of hip-hop feminism. It remains one of my most treasured connections to a woman who never made it easy to be connected. Tellingly, her ownership of the book, her own signature in the opening pages to mark ownership, tells me more about my mother than she ever told me. I was in college learning about anti-colonial movements courtesy of Professor Joe Gallagher, the white professor who taught the only African history course at my institution. It was there I was introduced to Patrice Lumumba. And yet when I heard the name, I immediately remembered the rhythms of the song that my mother played when I was a child. Unlike the books I could liberate, my mother's copy of Makiba's Keep Me in Mind was unplayable. It was an 8-track, long out of print. It would be well into my adulthood when I would finally rip a copy of the song. And again, there was no clue as to why that album found its way into my parents' collection. To be sure, there were other more regular, if you will, artifacts of my parents that fed a young Black child's imagination, including the bevy of Al Green and Luther Ingram records that were on regular rotation, the Essence magazines where I first encountered Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, and Alexis DeVoe, who would later become my graduate advisor. Having spent a lifetime bearing witness to my mother's impulsive buying habits, I can't be sure that these oddities were the byproduct of that impulsiveness or something more intentional. Nevertheless, for a Black boy born in the South Bronx, these oddities provided important connections and landscapes for a budding scholar's imagination that were as important as any gleaned from the public square or in the narrow rows of the E185 section of the campus library.
Your love means so much to me, girl, and your kiss means so much to me. Your touch
before Black Twitter. That it was another time and place is hardly the matter. It was my world, a 2-mile radius that would take you from 168th Street and 3rd Avenue, Forest Avenue and 166th Street, that intersection of Boston Road, we never called it Boston Post Road in the Bronx, and 168th Street, and St. John's Church on Fulton Avenue, where that Head Start was housed. If 1231 Fulton Avenue, nestled between 168th and 169th Streets and across the street from Bronx Lebanon Hospital, was the epicenter of my life, the stoop at that address was the epicenter of that residence. Years before I knew who Jürgen Habermas was, or was introduced to the concept of a black public sphere, or could wrap my head around a global black diaspora connected across a micro-blogging platform called Twitter, the very spirit of Black Twitter could be found on that stoop in front of 1231 Fulton Avenue and many such stoops across America. The stoop in its country, though not necessarily Southern cousin, the porch, has evoked recently in 2 museum projects, such as the planned expansion of the Studio Museum in Harlem, and of course the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened in Washington, D.C. last fall. Architect David Ajay, who along with Phil Freelon designed the National Museum and is the primary designer on the Studio Museum project, explained to the New York Times that he, quote, wanted to honor this idea of public rooms, which are soaring, celebratory, and edifying. Between the residential and the civic, we learned the lessons of public realms and tried to bring them together. The porch that greets the National Museum and the reverse stoop planned at the Studio Museum are less about nostalgia, but the continuous desire of Black folk in America to cultivate private and public space outside of the home, but away from the surveillance of the mainstream. In this regard, Black Twitter is still trying to find consistent digital strategies for the analog examples that the stoop and the porch represented, though of course the stoop and the porch never had the reach of Black Twitter. As a little boy, me and the Jamaican princess turned hip-hop feminist icon spent many afternoons dreaming of places that our words would conjure a generation later. We're on a world tour with Muhammad, my man, going each and every place with a mic in our hand. My favorite memories, though, are summer evenings circa 1974-75, where it seemed that the whole building set up shop with folding chairs and card tables that extended beyond both sides of the stoop. My mother, as a Baltimore girl, with that city's landscape of row houses that had their own stoops, found a second home on that 1231 stoop. We'd often wait outside until my father got home, usually after 10 o'clock from his short order cook gig in Brooklyn, usually bearing treats. The Orange Hostess cupcakes for me, a pack of Winston's for my mom from the bodega down the street. While I was busy playing ghetto games, I'd red light, green light, and freeze tag, and sneaking glances at no longer prepubescent Black girls doing double dutch. The adults, with smatterings of patois, Spanglish, and down-home speak, could be heard in the background discussing everything from the frayed marriage of Bill Withers and actress Denise Nicholas, Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974, the financial crisis, and national recession that put New York City on the brink of default, the genius of Muhammad Ali, and whether Jermaine Jackson was really leaving the Jackson 5. Those were the last summers that I spent at 1231 Fulton Avenue. The very financial struggles that working class families were experiencing throughout New York City drove my family into the projects. And while there were courtyards and other public spaces to set up in our neighborhood, and often to aid the surveillance of the neighborhood, the kind of vibrant community that I experienced on the stoop was largely lost to me. That is, until the advent of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Many thanks given to Black Lives Matter for making Black Twitter a thing, but Black lives mattered on those stoops. A reminder, perhaps, that even if the technology might be brand new, our humanity and our connection to it ain't.
If you let me make love to you, then why can't I touch you? Why
mixtape love. I guess even back then I knew that couldn't nobody mess with my mixtape game. Perhaps a minor fact clearly born out of the fact that a brother knew it was the only game he had. Too nerdy, too square, too safe, too mama's boy, and perhaps too shy. Confessions from a boy who was always more archivist than player pimp. The joy of my adulthood is that I get to play in the archive. We'll talk some major shit. The data has spent quiet, intimate, sensual times up in those stacks. And it was the procuring of those sonic archives that was a young teen's passion. As a Bronx kid in the late 1970s, many of my peers were digging in crates looking for obscure breakbeats. Yet the first cassette tapes that I owned were mostly used to capture snippets of music on New York City's pop radio stations like WABC, WXLO, and WCBS-FM with its oldies format. To this day, I can break out into a stirring rendition of Ambrosia's that "How Much I Feel." Yeah. While many of my homies were bumping Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, the Sugar Hill Gang, Curtis Blow, and the Crash Crew on first-generation boomboxes, I was cultivating a world of romantic sonic interiority, very closely guarded and highly curated mixtapes. The day that I got outed for my taste in pop top 40 love pablum was the day that I had to switch my shit up. Sitting in class listening on a first-generation Walkman knockoff to Ronnie Dyson's "If You Let Me Make Love to You, Why Can't I Love You," when some little gal felt compelled to grab my headphones and check what a brother was listening to. To be fair, Ronnie Dyson remains a favorite, one of the purest pop soul voices of the 1970s, right alongside the late Cuba Gooding Jr., Natalie Cole, and a teenage Michael Jackson. But "Why Can't I Love You" sounds like a bunch of white folks listening to a black guy around the campfire in one of them Frankie Avalon movies from the 1960s. He ain't getting the girl or boy, and he's singing for his dinner. The new sonic archive that I mined and mixed was my mother's. My dad's archive would figure much later. My mother, who loved Alaga-style Southern soul, where Al Green was an obvious fixture, but where Dorothy Moore and Luther Ingram were also clear favorites. For many, Moore is a one-hit wonder who nearly topped the pop charts in 1976 with the ballad Misty Blue, but the joint that stuck to me then and still now was the long-forgotten ballad called "I Believe You." Ingram, like Moore, had his own moment of pop stardom with the ballad "If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Do Right." And while the song got regular spins on my father's Fisher stereo, my mother's archive was primarily on 8 tracks, it was those album cuts that stayed with me for years. Ingram's "I'll Love You Until the End" was the soundtrack of every little brown gal that gave me a rise until I was 15. And let me be clear, before I had any idea who Mr. Vandross was, Luther Ingram was the only Luther that mattered. As Michael Jackson taught me late in 1979 with "She's Out of My Life," sometimes a little heartbreak can get a brother focused. I can't remember what little gal it was that broke my heart or I imagined would break my heart, but I knew that I was never going to be that dude. That dude was Teddy Pendergrass, who became my mother's go-to soul singer when Al Green gave up the flesh for the sacred word. My text of choice, side B of Teddy Pendergrass's "Life is a Song Worth Singing," with the suite of "Close the Door," "It Don't Hurt Now," which still moves a brother in a certain kind of way, and "When Somebody Loves You Back." I was 15, and what Pendergrass represented for me was the symbol of the alpha male, which I already knew I was never going to be. This was alongside his clear expressions of vulnerability, articulated most powerfully in the limits of his voice, which cracked and creaked. And while so much of this shit was all up in my head, when the hurt was finally real, and this little girl I do remember because I would eventually marry her, it was joints like Pendergrass's "I Can't Live Without Your Love," Rick James and Tina Marie's "Fire and Desire," and the more obscure fare like Booker T. Jones's "I Came to Love You" and Michael Henderson's "Take Me, I'm Yours," that provided sonic catharsis. What I found myself committing to those mixtapes as I transitioned from high school to college was the most complex version of myself. The me that I most wanted to be was always going to be found in the mix. Some of that complexity was simply in the presentation of those mixtapes. Every one of those tapes featured visuals, usually cut out of my mother's Ensis magazines, a thing I borrowed from a college peer, understanding then about the importance of aesthetics in the curation of the archive. Our shit more broadly has never been about boxes and storage bins. For me, those mixtapes were not just a reflection of my love of music, but a recognition of the thoughtfulness that went into constructing sonic representations of my passions, desires, and moods. Like the DJs who worked months in advance and created mixes as folks were here on the dance floor at the club, I always understood, even before I had the language to explain it, that these mixtapes represented my intellectual property. They were not simply songs thrown together randomly in a sequence decided by some record company executive, but an attempt at meaning making that went beyond the intent the artists whose songs might have appeared to on those tapes. I still have many of those mixtapes, as much an archive of the transition from analog to digital, though it's rare that I listen to them now, if only because automobile manufacturers are not inclined to equip new cars with cassette players. With the emergence of handheld digital devices that could easily store thousands of sound recordings, my now retired iPod Classic held more than 16,000 songs. My relationship to my sonic archive has been radically transformed. Streaming technologies have again transformed how we consume and archive our media as folks simply listen to music via services like Pandora and Spotify. For some, it is simply a question of how do you build a better delivery system for what is a multi-billion-dollar music consumption industry. Despite these innovations to the delivery system, I am still devoted as ever to crafting playlists, as I did when I was a teen, resisting using streaming music services despite the unprecedented access they offer to music archives until fairly recently. My devotion to the analog in this instance is less the unwillingness to embrace the future, but remembering how much of myself I put into those mixtapes 30 years ago, and how much those mixtapes helped me recognize the man that I wanted to be in the world.
Oh, Lord, hear me. Hey. Lord, please send her to me. It's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Lord, please send her to me. Ladies and gentlemen, this time around, the revolution will not be televised. Woo! As we proceed to give you what you need. Oh, 9 brother. Get it live, brother. Ladies and gentlemen of the court. And the hearing against State of Hip Hop versus Electronic. I present Exhibit C. When I was sleeping on the train, sleeping on Mesereau Lab out in the rain, without even a single slice of pizza to my name. Too proud to beg for change, mastering the pain. When New York niggas was calling Southern rappers lame, but then Jack and I slang. I used to get dizzy spells, hear a little ring, the voice of an angel telling me my name, telling me that one day I'ma be a great man, transforming with the Megatron dawn, spitting out flames, eating whack rappers alive, shitting out chains. I ain't believe it then, nigga, I was homeless, fighting, shooting dice, smoking weed on the corners, trying to find the meaning of life in the corona, till the 5%ers rolled up on the nigga and informed them. You either build or destroy, where you come from. The Magnolia Projects in the Third Ward slum, It's quite amazing that you rhyme how you do and that you shine like you grew up in a shrine in Peru. Question 14, Muslim lesson 2. Dip diver, civilizer 85er. I make the devil hit his knees and say to our Father, abracadabra. You rockin' with the true and living. Shout out the lights out.
Black interiorities. Can you hurry up and think? And such seems the demand for the intellectual committed to deep thinking and intricate moves of this post-structuralist kind in a world where things like mortgages, car notes, 401ks, prep school applications, and the next episode of The Real Housewives of Atlanta seem motivation to do everything but deep thinking. It is perhaps easy to think that the expansiveness of contemporary culture and our access to an archive of digital data that was unimaginable even a decade ago to translate into a requisite expansiveness of easily available deep thought. I'm not always quite sure when so much cultural criticism masquerades as little more than lowbrow film and music reviews with the thesaurus-sized words that say very little about aesthetics, politics, and modes of production. I stand accused. I'm as guilty as any in this endeavor. The reality is that there's so little available space and time for deep thought and even deeper explication of ideas in the world that has little value for either. Hurry up and think, hurry up and talk, hurry up and write seems to be the definitive mode of expression. And I would argue for the geniuses whose shoulders every one of us hopes to claim that we stand on, there was little choice but to find the space and place for deep thought because it was literally a matter of life and death. I am reminded, as always, of Fred Moten's description of Harriet Jacobs writing at irregular intervals against the specter of anti-abolitionist discipline and surveillance. Escape to freedom? More like an escape to my own damn mind, Jacobs might have been desiring to say. Recalling the late Sekou Sundiata's notion that we were dreamed by some slaves just trying to find the freedom to climb into their own imagination, the little things we take for granted. Recalling yet another, this time bluesman Albert King and his own recollection of something that Ivy Jo Hunter once said, "When I lost my baby, I almost lost my mind." Because to lose your mind is something like death. And even your roundaway rapper understands this, ordering thoughts on scribblings, no doubt on an Android device, bought and paid for by illicit moments on subways, at bus stops, in tenement vestibules, and during break time at McDonald's. I think Harriet Jacobs has quite a bit to teach us about the 21st century Negrogentia. On the run, as Moten might again say in response to any query about what animates black art, or as Moten did say, black art stages it, performs it by way of things breaking and entering and exiting the exclusionary frame of putatively ennobling, quickling representations to which they are submitted. Like those down-home spirituals of old who in making a way of a no way had to think themselves free. But freedom and escape from what? For Jacobs, freedom was a crawl space underneath the house. And some might ask, what kind of freedom is that? It is, as Moten might say, or rather did say, the lawless freedom of the imagination. And perhaps we've been a little too literal about this thing called freedom. If being on the run doesn't allow us to be one with our minds, the ultimate feedback loop as being in conversation with your own mind beyond the demands to hurry up and think like one might have to if always on the run. So escape and the resistance to fugitivity might fuel a few lasting and even timeless expressions in the church of blackness, but never without the chance to engage our own minds, where we can still, even in captivity, imagine a freedom intellectually, mentally, philosophically, and spiritually that we can scribble on the walls of crawl spaces, be they Facebook, Tumblr, or even Black Twitter, and more than a few words about that in a bit. I'd like to suggest that this very personal yet communal feedback loop, a rapid, all-encompassing exchange of information, genetic, philosophical, and akin to what filmmaker Arthur Jafer has located in Ernie Isley's opening solo from the Isley Brothers' Voyage to Atlantis. This feedback loop, I'd like to suggest writ large as blackness, partially explains why blackness never seems to fully emancipate itself from the very dynamics that blackness aspires to transcend. This digital distortions, perhaps we might say, in some other realms, those mystical realms that we often simply refer to in hushed tones these days as Black Twitter. A magical and digital Black interiority that binds the public with the private, that is indecipherable without access to this Black interiority of what I might call Black channels. But first, a few words about Black Twitter. Recalling Manju's 2010 Slate piece, which addressed how Black people use Twitter. Another example of mainstream causes fascination, even obsession with the ways that Black people have utilized technology. The conversation remains the same. Instead of Booker, what are the drums saying, as political scientist Adolph Reed once famously described the work of Black public intellectuals, the question now is, what are those niggas tweeting? Perhaps this is as it should be. Black folks are in a unique position of having once been cutting-edge technology, the kind of technology that helped drive the United States into advanced capitalism and global domination. Such intimacies have historically manifested themselves in innovative and quirky uses of technology. 2 turntables and a mixer, Sky pagers accessed by late 20th century drug dealers with designs on a 21st century global economy. And of course, the folk in apartment 2B, who've had cable since 1982, or rather at least a decade before Time Warner and Cablevision showed up in the hood. Yet there are other more concrete examples to consider. Twitter is nothing more than advanced technology used to animate existing and new social networks. Those networks have always existed. The field songs utilized by the enslaved Africans on southern plantations was a form of social media. Hell, there was a time not so long ago when the stoop was our Twitter. One of the best examples of such social media, of course, is the Greensboro sit-ins, February 1, 1960. This protest began weeks of similar protests that went viral throughout the American South in ways that mirror the functions of today's social media. The tools of the trade, what we might think of as analog social media, word of mouth, the mimeograph, and black radio. It should not be surprising that black worldviews would impact the uses and functions of social media. As social media researcher Brendan Metter suggested in Manju's piece, black folks are using Twitter like a public instant messenger. Perfectly logical for communities whose very presence in the West has been framed by the challenge of remaining in contact with kinfolk, fictive or otherwise, given the reality of relocation, dislocation, incarceration, separation. Reminded of the late Richard Iton's notion of diaspora that was about roots, but not R-O-O-T-S, but rather roots, R-O-U-T-E-S. Whether referencing drum rhythms in Congo Square in the 18th century, where enslaved Africans smoked back to the continent, or jazz samples in the 1990s, hip-hop that allowed older black men and their sons to cultivate a space of commonality. The black embrace of technology has always been about seeking different arenas to access our humanity. Somewhere, Oliver Wendell Jones, with a nod to Oliver Wendell Harrington, are smiling. I am inspired in this instance by the wisdom of Elizabeth Alexander, who talks about a, quote, black life and creativity behind the public face of stereotype and limited imagination. The black interior is a metaphysical space beyond the black public. Tapping into this black imaginary helps us to envision what we are not meant to envision. Complex black selves, real and enactable black power, rampant and unfetishized black beauty. Big-ass name you gave me. I'm still left juxtaposing the image of you at the end. Small, fragile, defeated, with the defiant, bombastic, yet still miniature figure that I've come to know and would come to know in the story shared after your demise. Wish I had known that 16-year-old who stepped out of her mama's home and up to the big city. I can no more come to terms with those last days of yours than I can imagine my own daughters in such a state. Yet that's the cycle. I am mad at you. I say that now to get it out of the way, as I was never able to get it out of the way when you were alive, because my ability to say it, even think it, cluttered our relationship as it clutters my memories of you and death. Your granddaughter, the youngest one, the one who most reminds me of you, the one who is willful and wise beyond her proverbial years, matter-of-factly just asked me if I was sad. I was sad. Not today or even yesterday, but those other days, you up in the nursing home in the Bronx, me sitting next to you as often as I could, yet unable to reach you. As a child, your biggest gift to me was the attention that you gave me. And it's not that I didn't have my father's, your husband's attention, but you seem to understand better than any that caution was my nature, that I was more than comfortable in the smallness of it all. You gave me that big name. Used it as a calling card for the possibilities I would confront. Many will recall hearing you announce my name before they ever met me. Whatever Mark Anthony Neal is in the world, you imagined that for me, even if you had no idea what that would look like. The name was always bigger than I wanted to be, yet that was you. Your fear of not being heard, of not being seen, for real dark-skinned black girl anxieties that manifested itself in so many unhealthy ways. The fear of not being taken seriously. If the world was not gonna take you seriously, they were for damn sure gonna take your baby boy seriously with that big ass name that you gave him. Made him own it as a child. In the end, I now realize that I never felt invisible or silenced because I always knew that you had my back, even when you tore into it. I was often embarrassed by the bigness of your personality, not yet aware of all that it masked until you took that last breath. The smallness of you at the end betrayed the bigness that was you. One of your husband's biggest gifts to me was the example to not be threatened by the bigness of the woman you chose to share your life with. It has served me well in the home that I share with your two daughters and your daughter. You would be proud of both of your granddaughters. Little doubt you'd be put off by the oldest, who is as emotionally detached from family as her father, your son, was for much of your time on earth. She too is ambitious and focused and particularly adept at masking the hurts, slights, the invisibility born of her real dark-skinned black girl anxieties that she will never publicly claim because that's not her way. Oh, what I wouldn't give for her to spend just an hour with the best of you and the best of your mother. True to her spirit, when I spot her on the pool deck, it's not because she's one of the handful of black women on the deck, but because of the white pearls that always adorn her ears and the smile that matches it. We all have our masks. But the other one, the youngest one, the one who most reminds me of you, the one who is wise and willful before her, beyond her proverbial years, who matter-of-factly just asked me if I was sad. She, as one person described her, is black girl magic. Don't get me wrong. She is as difficult as you were, as you are. I would have paid some money to watch the two of you go at it. But as one of her teachers once admitted, baby girl is big on justice. Initially born out of her willing acknowledgement, dark-skinned black girl anxieties be damned, that she would not be ignored or rendered invisible, but now more often than not in the advocacy of others. She will be the one who will claim you big, hence her knowingly pushing me to think about you at this moment. As I write this, your city is still smoldering in the aftermath of another death of a black person at the hands of law enforcement. I know New York, the Bronx, was the place that you lived and raised me, but Baltimore was always your home. There's a mother who publicly chastised her son for being up in those rebellious streets. She would not be foreign to you. I offer no judgment regarding her actions, recalling similar moments in my own childhood, like that night you showed up at the park, belt in hand, looking for a son who should have already been home. Thank God there were not handheld devices. Though the social media of the day, word of mouth, guarantee that more than a few of my peers would recall that moment, much to my embarrassment, almost 40 years later. I still walk this earth in part because of those actions on your part. I just wish that you had stayed on earth long enough for me to finally understand why you made those choices and to thank you for them. I may never live up to that big ass name you gave me, but I thank you for providing the challenge.
feel like I have been to church. I've been to school. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you. You have truly set the bar high for what we plan in the future years for this lecture. Wow, incredible. So there's nothing more to say here. So this is almost like now you can go to Repass, and those of you, some of you know what Repass is. So there is a reception down the hall where you can further talk with Mark Anthony, but also I would have been sharing books with you at this time, but you have partaking of the books already. I can't tell you thank you enough, and I hope for all of you who are attending, this is just really a moment to acknowledge that Black faculty have been on this campus for 50 years, and aren't we glad about it? So. Thank you, and enjoy the reception.